In the early years of the Genesis, Sega had trouble competing against Nintendo. Nintendo had all the third-party support, while Sega barely had any. But surprisingly, a well-known company would stand up against Nintendo and agreed to partner with Sega instead. That company would be none other than EA. Their boxes and cartridges looked a bit different from regular Genesis games. Why is that, and why would EA partner with Sega rather than Nintendo? Let's take a look. What's going on? It's Podrez coming at you with another video. So I make videos once a week, so if you want to be notified whenever I make a new one, just hit that subscribe button right there. It only takes a second, but it helps our community to grow. And we do have a Discord server, just go to discord.podrez.net. I'll also put a link right in the description. Alright, we're just going to get right into it. EA games on the Sega Genesis.
And that. Give me that again. Timeout. If it's in the game, it's in the game. John Madden Football 93 for Super NES and Sega Genesis.
Where'd that truck come from?
Atari did not have any sort of quality control when it came to the supported games. The 2600 didn't have a lockout chip that prevented third-party games from working, so theoretically any company could make a game without Atari's knowledge. This is what's believed to have caused the video game crash of 1983. Because there was a lot of low-quality games that were hitting the market, no one had any way of knowing whether a game was good or not. Even some of Atari's own releases were said to have a negative impact. Sometimes inappropriate games were being released as well, like adult-themed ones. Atari clearly made a mistake by giving third-party companies too much freedom, so when they released the 7800, every game had to be digitally signed by Atari. This was a step in the right direction, but it was too late. When Nintendo released the NES, they recognized Atari's mistake with the 2600 and they came up with a solution. They required all games to be licensed by them first. This gave Nintendo control over what games would be released on their console. This way, they could potentially prevent low-quality games from being released. They also wouldn't allow inappropriate games to be released, like adult-themed or religious-themed games. Because of these changes, if you were to buy an NES, you were more likely to get a game that was better quality than if you went with an Atari console. However, Nintendo wanted a little too much control. If you wanted to release games for the NES, you had to sign a contract that made you agree to some terms. You had to use the standard gray NES cartridges, and you had to pay for all of them yourself, which was expensive. You were also restricted to 5 games a year. But the rule that would affect Nintendo's competition was the exclusivity agreement. Nintendo's official licensees could not make games for any other console. For example, Konami couldn't port Contra or Castlevania over to the Master System. These requirements most likely had nothing to do with combating the video game crash, but instead was a way to kill the competition. So what if you didn't like Nintendo's policies and you wanted to make games behind their back? You could, but Nintendo made it as inconvenient as possible to do that. You had to find a way around Nintendo's lockout chip, and even then, Nintendo prevented retail stores from selling unauthorized games. There were some unlicensed game companies, but they all struggled to find a safe home for their games because of Nintendo's pushback. One company that struggled against Nintendo was Sega. Despite the Master System being technologically superior to the NES, the console would miss out on a lot of great titles that the NES had. There was no Konami or Capcom to port over Contra or Mega Man to the Master System. When Sega released the Genesis in 1989, the CEO, Michael Katz, came up with a creative way to get around Nintendo's superior third-party support. They would secure licenses to well-known properties like famous singers, athletes, and cartoon characters to entice potential buyers as much as possible. Sega would also secure the license to a few Capcom arcade titles, which they put to good use. During the early days of the Genesis, we would see some decent games, but they were struggling to compete against Nintendo's superior lineup of games. Sega's own IPs and a few celebrity-endorsed games are not going to be good enough. Most companies didn't bother making games for the Genesis because there wasn't as much money there. It made more sense to become a Nintendo licensee where you would be developing games for the best-selling console. This meant that Sega wouldn't have a lot of third-party developers. I mean, who's gonna sign in to Team Sega? Surprisingly, there was one company that gave them a chance. In the early 80s, Trip Hawkins was working for Apple. Noticing the increasing popularity of home computers, Hawkins expressed interest in starting his own company. In 1981, he would do just that. Originally, the name was Amazing Software, but would eventually become Electronic Arts. Initially, EA stuck with releasing games on computers like the Commodore 64, Amiga, Apple II, and others. However, they would eventually take notice of the NES. They would publish 2 games on the console, but EA was not a big fan of Nintendo's strict policies. They decided against becoming an official Nintendo licensee in favor of its competition. Sega was way more lenient with third-party developers than Nintendo was, but EA still wanted to negotiate a better agreement. Sega's approval process for third-party games was still pretty strict, and they required the third-party companies to pay for the manufacturing, which was expensive. EA would try to negotiate a better agreement, but when Sega refused, EA went the unlicensed route. Engineers at EA closely inspected the Genesis and wrote documentation on it. They even created their own development kit, which meant that they would not need Sega to make their games. This process took them about a month of preparation, but they were able to successfully reverse engineer the Genesis. But before making games, Hawkins decided to contact Sega one more time. This time, EA had more ammunition. Their terms were very simple. EA was going to release their games whether they reached an agreement with Sega or not. After all, they could now. Initially, Sega was not happy that EA went behind their back and reverse engineered their console. Sega already didn't have a lot of third-party support, and they were afraid that EA would pass off their findings to other third-party developers. Sega did not want to chance it, so they decided to offer EA a more lenient licensing agreement. This time, EA had more control over the manufacturing process. They could also release as many games as they wanted, and could even approve their own games. This was extremely convenient for EA because they save a lot of money and didn't have to go through Sega to release their games. Sega still did have the power to end their agreement with them though. Since EA was in control of manufacturing, their boxes had a different design and their cartridges looked much more different than a standard Genesis game. While EA did develop some of the games they would publish on the Genesis, they were mainly just a publisher. EA gave smaller developers a platform to showcase their games. With that said, let's take a look at a few of them. First, we'll try Zany Golf. This is one of EA's first titles, and it definitely shows. This is a very standard mini-golf simulator where you have a limited number of tries before you lose. The frame rate is absolutely terrible, and the presentation is horrible. It looks more like an early computer program than a Genesis game. Supposedly, there were unlicensed versions of this game that don't work on later Genesis models, but I was not able to find any source on this. The only source I did find were anecdotal forum posts on the internet. Now let's try Road Rash. This is one of the first EA games I think of. It's a racing game with an interesting twist. You can actually attack the other riders and knock them off their bikes. You can even fall off your own bike. When I was a kid, I used to abandon the bike and see how far I could make it on foot. When you do complete stages, you can earn money that you can use to purchase upgrades. The music is fantastic and really fits the mood of this game. The only thing I don't like is the poor frame rate. I think if they cleared that up, this would have been a more enjoyable experience, but this is still one of EA's best games on the Genesis. Here's Haunting starring Poltergeist. The plot is kind of morbid. You play as Poltergeist who passed away from a defective skateboard, and you must seek revenge by scaring the family who manufactured the skateboards. It's an isometric 3D perspective where you can hide inside objects and make them come alive. When you scare them too much, they leave the house, and you're supposed to make every family member leave to win. You can perform different actions when you enter certain objects. The animations are very well done, and I love the graphic style of this game. It's a lot of fun interacting with the objects and seeing what they do. This is a very unique title and a lot of fun to play. Now for John Madden Football. It's a standard football game with some cool innovations. The field is in a 3D perspective, which is impressive to see on the Genesis. Both teams have 11 players, which is something John Madden himself wanted. He even refused to endorse the game if they went with less. Unfortunately, this game does not have the NFL license, so the teams are just generic. Because of the 3D perspective, this game gets extra points for innovation. Most other games would go with a basic top-down view. Otherwise, this is a pretty basic football game. This would later on become the Madden series, which would receive a new game every year. This is one of the complaints that people have about EA, the fact that they constantly recycle games without making that many changes. Here's Lotus Turbo Challenge. It's a standard racing game where you have a time limit and each checkpoint gives you a time extension. The game has different terrain and weather conditions you have to drive through, so there's some nice variety. Some of the effects they pulled off are cool, like the fog in Stage 2 and the 3D bridges that you go inside of. It's weird how the gameplay is all squished at the bottom of the screen while the top is almost completely unused, probably for 2-player mode. And the game is surprisingly lenient when you crash. In most games, when you hit an object on the side of the road, your car flips over, but here it just slows you down a little bit. There's also Lotus 2, which adds some extra polish. Now you have different music choices and different cars that you can pick from. Lotus 2 is also much easier than the first one. Both of these games are decent and worth trying, but this is another example of a common complaint about EA. They commonly take a single vehicle license and make a whole game out of it, sometimes multiple of them. This is something they would do on later consoles too. There's a few other titles that are worth talking about too. Populous is another early title where you're a ruler and you manage your own world of people. Battle Squadron is a difficult but fun shooter with many weapon upgrades and colorful graphics. So you might look at EA like the bad guys because of how they reverse engineer the Genesis and tried to scare Sega into agreeing to their terms. But to be fair, EA did offer a great library of games to the Genesis. We got a couple racing games, a shooter, sports games, and more. Sega desperately needed more third-party companies on board, and they weren't in a position to be too strict with them. Sega could have easily put an end to the agreement, but they wouldn't have gotten EA's strong lineup of games. Despite the rocky start, EA's contributions to the Genesis would be positive. Most companies who didn't like Nintendo's policies still reluctantly worked with them because they had the best-selling console. But EA was one of the few companies that said no to Nintendo, and they would take their business elsewhere. Sega was initially pretty strict with third-party publishers, but EA would negotiate better terms. EA agreeing to publish games on the Genesis would give Sega the big break they needed to stand up against Nintendo. Hey, I just wanted to thank you so much for watching this video. If you made it this far, hit that like button. If you enjoy this type of content, hit the subscribe button for more content. Both of these things really help the channel grow. If you have anything to share, feel free to leave a comment. I read every single comment on this channel, and I'm pretty good at replying back. Anyway, have a good one.